Haarlem, Netherlands, 1943. A teenage Dutch girl with braids steps out of a bakery line into the cold. She is small, thin, the kind of kid you would expect to see carrying books, not a weapon. She flashes a shy smile at a German officer, trades a few harmless words, and asks if he would walk her toward the woods. He follows. Minutes later, he is face down in a shallow ditch, and she is already gone, pedaling a bicycle with a pistol hidden under a loaf of bread. Her name is Freddie Oversteegen. She was 14 years old, and she used flirting as a weapon. If you clicked because the title promised an innocent Dutch teenager who lured Nazis to their deaths, this is that story. The officer she lured was not a fool. He was just human. He saw a teenager, maybe thought of a sister back home, and his guard dropped. That was the whole point. The resistance understood that German soldiers expected trouble from men, not from girls, and Freddie walked right through that blind spot. It is the first lesson of her story. Wars are not just won by strength, they are won by exploiting what the enemy assumes. In a country as small and watched as the Netherlands, those assumptions were the difference between life and death. Every mission depended on that slim margin. Hold on to that, because it explains how a teenager could change the course of events around her. Most people picture World War II as tanks, generals, and big battles on a map. That is part of it, sure, but the war also lived in back alleys, on bicycles, and in the hands of teenagers who never asked for a fight. This is a story about the Dutch resistance and about a female spy who looked harmless, a teen honey trap who turned a smile into a weapon. It is also a story about choice, about a young girl who decided that doing nothing was not an option. Here is why this story sticks in your ribs. The Nazis expected teenagers to be quiet, to keep their heads down, to think about dances and school. Freddie did not fit their script. She used the fact that people underestimated her as a weapon, and that is a rare kind of courage. It is the kind of courage that does not look like a charge across a battlefield. It looks like a slow walk beside a man who thinks he is in control. And the other layer, the one that matters most, is that she kept a moral compass. She drew lines she would not cross. We are going to hit that moment later, because it tells you who she really was. For now, keep this image in your head. A small girl with a bicycle and a pistol riding past a German checkpoint like she is late for school. It is the ultimate contrast, and it is why the Nazis never fully understood who they were fighting in the Netherlands. The contrast is the hook, but the heart is what came after, in the quiet days when she had to live with what she did. Before we dig into the details, let me set the tone. This is a war guru-style deep dive, not a glossy movie summary. I am going to walk you through the streets, the fear, the small decisions that led to big consequences. There is no sugar here, just the way it was. And if you have ever wondered how ordinary people find the guts to do the impossible, stick with me. To understand how jarring this was, you need to see Haarlem before the war. It was a canal city, brick streets, bicycles everywhere, markets full of herring and bread. People knew their neighbors. The church bells set the rhythm of the day. Kids played by the water, and older men argued about politics over coffee. It looked like 1,000 quiet towns in Europe, the kind of place you would pass through and think, nothing ever happens here. That calm is important because the occupation smashed it. For a lot of people, the invasion felt impossible until the day German boots were on their street. That is part of why the early resistance was so gritty. It was not built by soldiers. It was built by regular folks who had to decide if they were going to accept the new order or push back. Freddie was growing up in that exact moment of choice. And before we go any further, let me ask you for a quick favor. If this kind of straight-shooting history matters to you, hit like and subscribe. It tells the platform that guys like us still care about these lessons, and it helps me keep bringing you these stories without watering them down. Now, let us rewind to the beginning, because you do not get a 14-year-old girl luring Nazis into the woods without a life that shaped her for it. Freddie Oversteegen was born in 1925 in Haarlem, just west of Amsterdam. Her sister Truus was 2 years older. Their mother, Truus, was a working-class woman with a steel backbone and a stubborn sense of right and wrong. Their father worked on barges and was often away. Money was thin, and peace in the house was thinner. They lived on a houseboat for a time, a narrow world that rocked with the water. If you have ever lived in a tight place, you know it makes a family either fall apart or learn how to breathe together. The Oversteegen girls learned to share everything. They slept on straw mattresses, wore hand-me-downs, and learned early that you do not wait for someone else to fix your problems. When their parents split, their mother took the girls into a cramped apartment above the canals. It was not much, but it was a place to stand. Freddie was not a troublemaker, but she was stubborn. She did chores, hauled water, helped patch clothes, and learned how to fix a bicycle chain before she was tall enough to reach the handlebars without standing on the pedals. She went to school when she could, but money and the changing world pulled at the family. She learned to read a room the way some kids learn to read a book. If an adult was tense, she felt it. If a stranger seemed nervous, she noticed. That sense of reading people became one of her greatest tools later. And like a lot of kids who grow up fast, she learned to carry responsibility quietly, without making a fuss. That is the kind of kid the resistance could trust. Her father was a quiet man who loved the water more than the city. When the marriage broke, he left in the only way he knew, working the barges and fading from their lives. Freddie remembered him less by words and more by the shape of his silhouette on a deck, a man who could not stay. That left the girls with a mother who was both strict and tender, a woman who expected them to stand tall even when the world pushed them down. That kind of upbringing hardens you early. Truus was a communist, but more than that, she was a doer. She believed that if you see injustice, you do not look away, you act. That belief is the root of everything her daughters did later. She brought food to neighbors with nothing, she took in people on the run, she hid Jewish refugees and political fugitives. She did it even when it put her girls at risk. That was the atmosphere Freddie grew up in. The constant sense that the doctor could open and a stranger in danger might step in. Freddie and Truus would wake up to whispered conversations in the kitchen and the sound of a new voice in the other room. Sometimes they did not even know the names of the people sleeping in their home, because names could kill. They learned how to keep secrets without being told. They learned how to listen without reacting. They learned that doing the right thing usually comes with a cost. The sisters made small dolls for children suffering in the Spanish Civil War, little cloth figures stuffed with what scraps they could find. It was a tiny act, but it trained their hearts to care about people they had never met. That matters later, when a teenager has to decide whether to risk her life for a family she barely knows. You do not suddenly become brave. You build it over years, one small choice at a time. Truus did not hide her views. She talked about fairness and about how fascism spreads when good people stay quiet. She attended meetings when she could, whispered with friends in kitchens, and kept banned pamphlets in a drawer. The girls heard those talks. They learned words like injustice and solidarity before they learned the math tables. It is easy to forget how political the 1930s were in Europe. People were choosing sides, even if they did not say it out loud. The Oversteegen house was small, but it was alive with the idea that ordinary people could make a difference. That seed mattered when the war forced their hand. Truus also taught them how to handle danger. She taught them to notice who was watching, to keep their eyes down, but their ears open. She told them, if someone asks too many questions, you say less, not more. If someone knocks at the door at the wrong time, you do not open it. Those small rules were survival lessons. When the war came, those habits became their shield. Then the war arrived on their doorstep. In May 1940, German forces invaded the Netherlands. The Dutch army fought for 5 days. Rotterdam was bombed into ruins. The government surrendered. Overnight, the streets of Haarlem changed. German boots on cobblestones, Nazi flags on the town hall, new rules posted on walls. The occupation was not just a military takeover, it was a daily grind of fear and control. Daily life became a series of small humiliations. You stood in lines for ration bread and came home with less than you needed. Coffee was replaced with bitter substitutes. Butter and meat became rare. People grew gardens in any patch of soil they could find. Listening to the British radio was illegal, but people did it anyway with the volume low and a towel over the set to muffle the sound. The Germans tried to make their presence feel normal by holding parades and posting smiling posters, but you could feel the pressure everywhere. It is hard to describe that constant weight unless you have lived under it. It is the feeling that someone else owns the space. You stand in. The Netherlands had been neutral in the previous war, and many hoped it would stay that way. People told themselves that the Germans would move on, that the storm would blow past. That hope died fast. Once the occupation settled in, ordinary people had to pick a side, even if they did not say it out loud. That was the quiet moment when resistance began to form in people's minds, long before there were weapons and code names. It started as a feeling, a refusal to accept the new rules as normal. Freddie's family felt it deeply. They were not waiting for permission to do the right thing. Jews were forced to wear yellow stars. Curfews were enforced. Radios were taken. Young men were ordered to work in German factories. Food was rationed. Bicycles, the lifeline of Dutch life, were regulated and sometimes confiscated. Every errand came with a checkpoint. Every night came with the worry that a truck would stop outside your house. This happens, but then this. A neighbor is taken, then another. Then a whole family is gone. That is how a city loses its soul. German propaganda filled the air. Posters claimed the occupation was for order and peace, but everyone could see it was about control. The radio played Nazi speeches. Schools were pressured to teach the German line. Some Dutch people complied, some resisted quietly, and some collaborated openly. The black market grew because rationing was so tight. You could smell coal smoke and fear in the streets. It was a gray, anxious time, the kind that wears people down. Freddie remembered the sound of boots on stairs and the way the entire building went quiet when the knock came. She heard the thud of rifle butts on doors. She saw women cry in hallways. She saw a Jewish family one day and an empty apartment the next. The Germans were not just occupying land. They were ripping away people. It was frightening, and it was personal. One turning point for Freddie came when a Jewish classmate disappeared. One day, the girl was in the schoolyard. The next day, her desk was empty and no one said her name. Another time, a family in their building was taken in the middle of the night. The parents were shoved into a truck, the children crying, a German soldier barking orders. That image stuck. It made the war real in a way newspaper headlines never could. You could call it politics before, but after that it was personal. That is when the idea of resistance stopped being a concept and became a need. And yet, the Oversteegen family did not hide. They fought back in the only ways they could. Truus helped distribute illegal newspapers and hide people on the run. Freddie and Truus joined her. At night, they rode bicycles through dark streets, past patrols with paste and paper under their coats. They would slap anti-Nazi posters over German propaganda, warnings not to work for the Germans, calls for freedom. Then they would pedal away, hearts pounding, knowing that if a patrol caught them, the penalty could be a bullet. Once, a German patrol stopped them, asking where they were going. Freddie said they were delivering bread to an aunt. The soldier looked at two girls, a loaf of bread, and waved them on. That was their second lesson in camouflage. If you look like you belong, you can pass. It was not just luck. It was their age, their faces, their ability to act normal when their hearts were racing. There were nights when the sisters had to hide in doorways while a patrol passed, their paintbrush still in their pocket and their hearts pounding. Once, they were cycling in fog and heard a truck engine behind them. They turned down a narrow alley and lifted their bicycles over a low fence into a yard, waiting in the dark until the engine sound faded. Moments like that taught them that luck favors the prepared. They never carried more papers than they could explain away. They kept their hands clean so they did not smell like glue. Small details, but small details keep you alive. Those early runs with leaflets were a kind of training on their own. The girls learned how to ride fast without looking like they were in a hurry. They learned to smile at a soldier while their heart beat in their ears. They learned to stash a brush and a roll of paper under a coat and keep their hands steady when a patrol walked by. A bicycle became more than a bike. It was a lifeline, a quick escape, and sometimes a weapon, because if you could ride through a crowd without drawing attention, you could move messages and supplies that kept the resistance alive. The girls learned to carry as little as possible. They memorized addresses instead of writing them down. They used simple code words, so if someone overheard them, it sounded like a grocery list. They never took the same route twice. Those small details were their armor. It is not just bravery that keeps you alive in a resistance network. It is discipline. In 1941, a man named Frans van der Wiel came to their docker. He led a local cell of the Dutch resistance, part of a wider underground network called the Council of Resistance. He had heard about the mother hiding Jews and the daughters spreading illegal leaflets. He wanted to recruit them. He asked Treintje if the girls could join. She said yes. The girls said yes. But he did not just hand them a badge. He tested them first. A few days later, he returned wearing a leather coat and acting like a Gestapo officer. He burst into the apartment shouting in German, waving a pistol, demanding to know where a Jewish man was hiding. Freddie and Truus did not flinch. They did not give up a name. They fought back. They kicked and hit and grabbed the gun. The man dropped the act and revealed who he really was. They had passed. They were the kind of recruits he needed. After the test, the sisters sat at the kitchen table with their mother and understood what yes really meant. It meant that their names could end up on a list, that a mistake could bring the Gestapo to their door. Treintje did not sugarcoat it. She told them they could say no, and she would still be proud. They looked at each other and said yes anyway. Freddie did not say it out loud, but she was thinking about the families they had hidden, the faces of people who had vanished. For her, saying yes was a way of keeping faith with those people. She was not chasing glory. She was stepping into a job that needed to be done. Then he told them what joining the resistance would really mean. It was not just leaflets. It was sabotage. It was intelligence. It was hiding people. And yes, it was killing. Truus looked at her sister. Freddie looked back and shrugged like a kid who did not understand the weight. She said something like, "Well, I have never done that before. It is almost funny, but it is also chilling. That is a teenager stepping into a war zone." Before they left, their mother gave them one rule: stay human. She said it like a command, not a suggestion. Stay human Even when the world goes savage, that line stuck to Freddie like glue. Every time she lied to a German officer, every time she hid a pistol under bread, every time she pulled a trigger, that line was there. It was a reminder that you can fight monsters without becoming one. That rule, stay human, also gave them a way to talk to themselves after a mission. Freddie would replay events in her head and ask if she had done the right thing, not in a courtroom sense, but in a soul sense. It is a hard question for anyone, especially a teenager. She was not trained by an army with a code of conduct. She was trained by a mother and a handful of resistance fighters in a potato cellar. So she made her own code and stuck to it. That kind of internal discipline is the only reason a person can go out and do violence without losing themselves. It does not erase the pain, but it gives it a frame. The resistance trained them in a hidden potato cellar outside Haarlem. Picture a cold, damp shed, the smell of earth and rot, a tiny window covered so no light would leak out. That is where a 14-year-old learned to shoot. She practiced aiming by candlelight, learned how to steady her breath, how to reload without looking, how to keep her hands from shaking. The instructors were old hands, men who knew that a weapon in a kid's hand is only as good as her discipline. They taught the sisters to clean their pistols, to count their shots, to keep a spare magazine hidden. They trained them to run after the shot, not before. They drilled them on routes, on escape points, on how to ditch a weapon if the police were closing in. It was not glamorous. It was mud and sweat and whispered instructions, but it saved their lives. In training, they learned with small pistols first, because those were easy to conceal. They practiced drawing the weapons smoothly, not in a rush, because a rushed draw could jam or slip. They fired at bottles and tin cans set on a dirt mound. They learned to breathe out before squeezing the trigger. They learned that in a cramped alley, a loud shot draws attention, so you fire and move. Sometimes they handled a larger weapon, a small submachine gun, but pistols were their main tools. Those sessions were not just about aim. They were about building muscle memory so that when fear hit, their hands would still do the right thing. At night, Freddie would lie awake and stare at the ceiling, thinking about what she might have to do. She talked with Truus in whispers about the difference between shooting a soldier in a firefight and shooting a man in the back of the head. They did not pretend it was easy. They just accepted that the war did not care about easy. That is part of why their mother's rule mattered so much. It gave them a compass when the map was broken. One of the hardest lessons was learning how to lie without flinching. The sisters had been raised to be honest, but war demands a different kind of truth. They practiced answering questions with calm voices, rehearsed simple stories about visiting family, memorized fake names. They learned to hide fear in their posture. That kind of acting is exhausting, and they did it day after day. It is easy to underestimate how much energy it takes to look normal when you are carrying a gun. The first assignment was not an assassination. It was arson. The Germans were storing supplies in warehouses guarded by soldiers. The resistance planned to burn those supplies, but the guards were in the way. This happens, but then this. Freddie and Truus were told to do what men could not do. They walked right up to the guards, two teenage girls, smiling and joking, asking for a cigarette, asking about the weather, teasing just enough to hold their attention. Behind the guards, resistance fighters slipped in with kerosene and rags. The warehouses went up in flames. The guards never knew what happened. That fire lit up the night sky, and for a brief moment you could see the whole district glowing. People whispered the next day, half scared, half proud. The Germans responded by tightening patrols and searching homes. That was the cost of resistance. Every success brought pressure. But it also showed the Dutch that the occupiers were not untouchable. Freddie remembered the smell of smoke and the rush of getting away clean. It was her first real taste of how sabotage could change the mood of a town. That mission showed the resistance something important. These girls could go places men could not. They could get close. They could talk their way past suspicion. A German officer might be on alert around young Dutch men, but he would relax around a polite teenage girl. Freddie and Truus learned to use that. It was not romance, it was tactics. It was a teen honey trap turned into a battlefield tool. After that, the sisters carried messages, delivered weapons, and helped plan sabotage. They cut telephone lines. They marked safe routes for people crossing fields at night. They helped move families from one hiding place to another. The work was endless and often dull, but it mattered. Every small task kept the larger machine of resistance alive. And then came the first kill. The resistance learned of a Dutch woman working for the Nazis, a collaborator who had compiled a list of Jewish families in the region. Names and addresses. That list was a death sentence. The resistance decided the list could not be delivered. Freddie was given the job. She rode her bicycle to a park, found the woman sitting alone, and asked her name. It was confirmation, nothing more. When the woman answered, Freddie pulled a pistol from her coat and shot her. Then she got back on her bicycle and rode away. Later, Freddie talked about what that first kill felt like. She said the first instinct after pulling the trigger is to help the person you just shot, to kneel down and lift them up. That sounds strange until you think about it. She was still a kid, raised to help, raised to be kind. The trigger did not erase that. It just forced it to fight with something new inside her. That is what war does. It pushes your instincts into a cage and tells you to pick which one lives. After that first assassination, Freddie went home and washed her hands, but she said she could still smell the gunpowder. Her mother looked at her and did not ask questions. They ate a simple meal. The house was quiet. That is another part people do not think about. You do a mission, and then you go back to a normal room and pretend you are normal. That is hard for a grown man. For a teenager, it is almost impossible. She carried that silence like a secret she could not share, and it made her feel older than her years. That moment never left her. She did not brag about it. She did not turn it into a story for a bar. She carried it like a weight. But she did not stop. The war was still there. The lists were still being made. The trains were still moving. This happens. But then, this. She killed to stop a list. Then she learned there were more lists. Then she learned there were more killers. From there, the missions escalated. The resistance needed people who could get close to targets. Freddie and Truus developed their own methods. They would go to taverns where German officers drank. One sister would start a conversation, laugh at a joke, touch a sleeve, lean in close. The officer would be flattered. Then she would say something simple, like, "Do you want to take a walk in the woods?" It sounds innocent. But that simple invitation was a trap. They would walk deeper into the trees, away from the roads. The other sister would already be waiting in the shadows. One shot. The officer would drop. The sisters would drag the body to a pre-dug hole and cover it. Then they would ride away on their bicycles like it was just another night. That is not romance. That is war. It is a honey trap with a gun at the end. There was a price for that method. Freddie had to pretend interest in men she hated. She had to laugh at jokes that disgusted her. Then she had to live with the knowledge that the same man would be dead minutes later. That kind of emotional whiplash can hollow a person out. She learned to separate the role from the self, to treat the flirting as a costume she put on and took off. It was a survival tactic, but it also left scars. When you fight a war with deception, you pay in ways people do not see. The walk into the woods was the hardest part. You are close enough to hear the officer's boots on the leaves, close enough to smell his cigarette. You are playing a role, smiling, nodding, while every nerve in your body is screaming. Then the signal comes, maybe a bird call or a glance, and the other sister moves. It happens fast, and then it is over. The two of them would pause for a breath, cover the body, and bike away with their hearts pounding like drums. Other times they used speed. Truus would ride the bicycle and Freddie would sit on the back with the pistol. They would spot a target on the street, ride past, and Freddie would fire a single shot. Then they would keep riding. Two girls on a bicycle. Nothing to see here. It was a cruel kind of efficiency. And in a town full of German checkpoints and Dutch collaborators, that efficiency kept them alive. The third method was the doorway. They would follow a target for days, learning his routine, his house, the time his wife left for the market. Then one sister would knock on the door. When he opened it, he would see a young Dutch girl who looked innocent and harmless. By the time his brain caught up to the danger, she was already gone. That is how a teenager turned the enemy's assumptions into a weapon. Targets were not chosen at random. The resistance watched people for days or weeks, learning their routines and checking their role. They wanted to be sure they were hitting a collaborator, not a man just trying to feed his family. Freddie sometimes argued with leaders about a target, asking for more proof. That kind of caution kept them from making mistakes. They also watched for bystanders. If children were nearby, they would postpone. It made operations harder, but it kept innocent blood off their hands. That was part of staying human, and it separated them from the enemy. Let me pause here for a second. If this story is hitting you the way it hits me, give the video a like and hit subscribe. I know a lot of you grew up around men who served, and these stories are part of that world. Your support helps keep the memory of the real people, not just the movies, alive. Working this close to the enemy was dangerous in more ways than one. These were teenage girls approaching adult men in uniform. The sisters had to control the situation at every step. They used code phrases with each other, small signals that told the other when to move, when to abort. If a German officer reached for a weapon, they were gone. If a patrol passed nearby, they would change direction, act casual, talk about groceries. The performance was as important as the pistol. Another constant danger was betrayal. The resistance used dead drops, short meetings, and code phrases to avoid being set up. Freddie would leave a message under a loose brick, or meet a contact for 2 minutes in a market, then walk away without looking back. The idea was to keep the web thin, so if one strand broke, the whole net did not collapse. That is why she kept her circle small and why she never talked about the numbers later. There were close calls. On one mission, a Dutch collaborator recognized Freddie from her neighborhood. He called her name. She froze for a heartbeat, then smiled and waved like she was just another local girl. She had to decide in that instant whether to run or keep the act. She kept the act, walked away, and later the resistance decided he had to be dealt with. That is how thin the line was. One mistake, one wrong face, and the whole network could come apart. By 1943, the Oversteegen sisters were known within the resistance. They were not loud about it. They could not be. The Germans were hunting anyone involved in the underground. The Gestapo and Dutch Nazi police were brutal. They used informers and torture, so the sisters kept their heads down. They lived normal lives in daylight, but at night they were scouts, messengers, sometimes executioners. This happens, then that happens, then it gets worse. The deeper you go, the harder it is to get out. One of the most important rules in resistance work is information. You had to know where the Germans were, who was collaborating, where a safe house could hide a family for a night. Freddie was good at that. She mapped routes in her head and memorized escape paths. She learned the rhythm of a German patrol and the hours when a street corner would be empty. That kind of awareness saved lives. It was not just about the bullet. It was about the run that followed. Then a new figure stepped into their circle. Her name was Hannie Schaft. If you are a World War II history buff, you already know the name. She was a law student in Amsterdam, bright, serious, and full of fire. She had red hair that made her memorable, which is the last thing a spy wants. When the Germans demanded that all students sign a loyalty pledge, Hannie refused. She was expelled, and she chose the resistance. She did not go home. She went underground. Hannie came from a different background than the Oversteegen sisters. Her family was more middle class. Her father was a teacher. She planned to work in law, to fight injustice in a courtroom, not in a forest. But the war closed that path, so she picked up a pistol instead. It is a hard turn, but it tells you how serious the occupation was. It pushed young people into roles they never imagined. Hannie was tested just like the Oversteegen sisters. Franz van der Wiel handed her a pistol and sent her to kill a German officer. She raised the gun, her hands shaking. She pulled the trigger. Click. The gun was empty. It was a test. She did not flinch. She passed. That is what the resistance needed, people who could keep their nerve when everything inside them wanted to bolt. Hannie became part of their cell, and suddenly you had 3 young women who were more dangerous than most men carrying rifles. The dynamic between them mattered. Truus was the leader, the tough one, the decision-maker. Freddie was the scout, the one who knew every alley, every ditch, every exit. Hannie was the thinker, the planner, the one who kept the details straight. Together, they were a complete unit. The bond between the sisters and Hannie was tight. They had to trust each other with everything, because a single mistake could end them all. They shared safe houses, shared food, shared fear. Freddie and Truus had grown up together, but Hannie brought a different energy, a kind of sharp focus that pushed them to plan every detail. Over time, they became a small family inside the larger resistance, a team that could move in silence and still understand each other. That is the kind of trust you cannot fake. They did not just assassinate targets. They sabotaged rail lines to slow deportation trains. They stole identity papers. They escorted Jewish children across fields at night. They gathered information on German troop movements and passed it to the Allies. And yes, when the time came, they killed Nazi officers and Dutch collaborators. Each job was a thread in a larger web of resistance. Information was just as deadly as a pistol. Resistance cells hid radios in attics and barns, tapping out messages to the Allies at night. If the Germans traced a signal, they raided the house, so the operators moved often. Freddie and Truus would escort couriers and sometimes carry parts of a radio in a bicycle basket disguised under groceries. When Allied planes dropped supplies in fields, the resistance marked the drop zones and hauled the crates away before dawn. Guns, medicine, even small explosives came that way. It was a quiet pipeline of war, and the sisters were part of it. Sabotaging rail lines was another kind of hell. You had to time it right, get in and out before a patrol came by, and sometimes do it in freezing rain. The sisters would watch the schedule, count the minutes between trains, and move like ghosts. They would place explosives or loosen bolts, knowing that a mistake could kill them or derail a train full of civilians. It was a dangerous dance, and it slowed the machinery that fed the camps. Let me give you a picture of a rescue run, because it is easy to gloss over. Imagine a mother in the middle of the night holding her child's hand, walking across a field toward a canal. The girl is terrified, the mother is shaking, and the moon is bright enough to cast shadows. Freddie would lead them, knowing which farmer could be trusted, knowing which path avoided the road. They would cross a ditch, jump a fence, and slide into a barn to wait out a patrol. That kind of work saved lives. It was quiet, but it was real. They also forged documents. A resistance contact would steal blank identity cards, and the sisters would deliver them to a safe house. A typewriter clacked late into the night. Stamps were stolen and pressed onto the paper. A new name, a new birth date, a new life. It was a paper war as much as a gun war, and those papers meant the difference between a family living and a family dying. The collaborators were often the most dangerous targets. This is a part of the war that does not get talked about enough. There were Dutch citizens who sold out their neighbors for money or power. They pointed out Jews. They betrayed resistance fighters. They worked for the Gestapo. Those were some of the most dangerous enemies of all, because they knew the streets, they knew the families, they knew the hiding places. The resistance called them a cancer, and they treated them like a surgeon treats a tumor. Cut it out or it kills the body. At the same time, the resistance drew a line. There was an order that came down to kidnap the children of a high-ranking collaborator, to use them as leverage. If he did not cooperate, the order said, the children would be killed. The sisters refused. They said, we are not Hitlerites. We do not murder children. That refusal tells you the difference between resistance and terror. They had killed many people. They would kill again, but they would not become what they were fighting. This is where I want you to understand the weight of what a 14-year-old girl was carrying. She was a kid, but she was making moral choices in a war that had erased most of the rules. That is not just bravery, that is character. It is easy to say you would do the right thing in a war. It is different when the right thing might get your mother shot. The moral debates inside the resistance were constant. Some members wanted to strike, hard and fast, no matter the cost. Others, like the Oversteegen sisters, insisted on limits. They asked hard questions. If a bomb on a bridge might kill civilians, do you do it anyway? If a collaborator's wife knows what he is doing, is she a target too? These are the kinds of questions that do not have clean answers. The sisters did not always get their way, but they did not stop asking. That is another way they stayed human, by refusing to let war turn them into machines. And if you are still with me, subscribe if you like the video. It is a small click for you, but it tells the platform to keep showing these stories to people who actually care. That keeps this channel alive and keeps these women from being forgotten. Back to the ground level. Imagine the daily routine. Freddie would wake up, put on a simple dress, maybe sew a patch on her coat, and ride into town like any other Dutch girl. But she was always watching. A soldier who lingered at a window too long, a neighbor who suddenly had extra food, a sign they were collaborating, a new checkpoint that meant an escape route was gone. She had to adjust. This happens, but then this, then this. The chessboard kept moving. One night, the sisters were told to meet a contact at a dockyard. It was windy, cold. They arrived and realized the contact was late. That meant two things. He was captured or he was being followed. They split up and disappeared into the shadows. That was one of their habits. They did not stay still. The resistance survived because it moved. A safe house was safe only until the day it was not. A routine was a death sentence. Freddie also learned that charm could be used like a knife. She would approach a German officer and talk about music or ask for directions. She would smile, but her hand would be ready, her escape route rehearsed. The officers, far from home, lonely and bored, would enjoy the attention. That is how a honey trap works. It is not romance, it is misdirection. It is the old rule of the battlefield. Make the enemy look where you want him to look. There was one operation in particular that shows how careful they were. They had intelligence that a Gestapo officer was visiting a safe-house neighborhood. That officer was responsible for arrests and deportations. The sisters set up a plan. Freddie would approach him near the train station, chat him up, and lead him toward a certain alley. In that alley, Truus would be waiting behind a stack of crates. It was timed down to the minute. It worked. The officer never made it home. The sisters rode away on their bicycles and slipped into a crowd at the market. The Germans responded with fear and rage. They increased patrols. They threatened collective punishment. They shot hostages. This happens, but then this. The more the resistance fought, the harder the occupation pushed back. Freddie and the others kept moving. They used fake papers. They changed hairstyles. They used bicycles because bicycles were common and could slip through narrow streets. Freddie hid weapons under bread, under flowers, under baby blankets. She looked like a teenager running errands. That was her camouflage. As the war dragged on, the stakes got higher. Deportation trains rolled out to the east. People whispered about camps. Hunger grew. The winter of 1944, the hunger winter, was cold and brutal. During the hunger winter, people ate whatever they could find. Some boiled tulip bulbs. Some made soup from potato peels and a thin scrape of fat. The sisters sometimes went on missions with empty stomachs, their legs shaking from lack of food. Hunger does not just hurt the body, it clouds the mind. It makes you impatient, sloppy. The fact that they kept operating under those conditions tells you how disciplined they were. They were fighting for a future they could barely feel in their bones. Food was scarce. People burned furniture to stay warm. Freddie and her family were not immune to any of that. And yet, they kept fighting. That is the part that is hard to imagine from a comfortable chair. The resistance fought while starving. They carried out missions while their stomachs were empty and their feet were frozen. Hunger makes people do strange things. Some turn to theft. Some turn to collaboration just to get extra food. The resistance had to operate in that fog, never sure if the person across the table was hungry, scared, or about to sell them out for a sack of potatoes. Freddie learned to read faces and hands. In war, you learn that survival is not just about courage, it is about judgment. Let me tell you a story about the moral cost. Truus was riding her bicycle one day when she saw a Dutch SS man, a collaborator, grab a baby from a family in the street. The family begged. The man smashed the baby against a wall. That baby died instantly. Truus pulled her pistol and shot him right there. It was not a planned mission, it was a reaction to pure evil. She said later that some things do not need orders. That moment haunted her, but she never regretted it. Now, it is easy to hear these stories and think of the resistance as a tight, well-oiled machine. It was not. It was a patchwork of small cells and brave individuals. People made mistakes. They got caught. They got tortured. Sometimes they broke. Freddie knew that every mission could be the last. That knowledge sharpens you. It also ages you. She was a teenager with the eyes of someone much older. By 1944, Hannie Schaft was one of the most wanted people in the Netherlands. Her red hair and pale skin had been seen too many times. The Germans put out descriptions. She dyed her hair, wore glasses, tried to vanish, but she could not stop fighting. She was part of operations that targeted high-value collaborators. She took risks that would make a grown soldier pause, and then one misstep set off a chain that would end her life. A fellow resistance fighter was captured and, under a trick, gave up Hannie's address. The Germans raided the house, arrested her parents, and sent them to a camp. Hannie went into hiding. She moved from safe house to safe house, unable to see her friends. The resistance told her to lay low, but the war was ending, and she wanted to keep fighting. That hunger to act is both noble and dangerous. It brings you into the light at the worst moment. March 1945. The Allies were pushing in. Liberation was close. The Germans were desperate and brutal. Hannie was riding a bicycle with illegal newspapers and a pistol when she was stopped at a checkpoint. They searched her and found the papers and the gun. She was arrested. She was taken to prison in Amsterdam and interrogated. They kept her in isolation. They beat her. They tried to break her. She did not give up a single name. Eventually, they noticed her hair growing in red at the roots. They realized they had caught the girl with the red hair, the one they had been hunting. Hannie was executed in the dunes outside Haarlem. She was 24 years old. She faced her killers and did not flinch. There is a line in the stories about her that her last words mocked the poor aim of the first executioner. Whether that is exact or not, the spirit is true. She went out as she lived, unbroken. Hannie's death hit the resistance hard. She was a symbol, and symbols matter in a war. Some fighters wanted revenge. Others worried the Germans would crack down even harder. Freddie and Truus had to push their grief aside and keep moving, because if they paused, the machine would roll over them. They honored Hannie the only way they could, by finishing the war and surviving to tell the story. And in the middle of all this, Freddie and Truus kept moving. They had lost friends. They had been close to capture more than once. They kept their heads down, kept their work quiet. That is the part people forget. The resistance did not end with one dramatic moment. It was day after day of small, dangerous decisions. Do you trust this person? Do you take this route? Do you pull the trigger? Do you refuse a mission? Every day was a test. There were close calls for Freddie, too. One time a checkpoint officer asked to search her bicycle. She smiled, talked about visiting an aunt, and let him rummage through the basket. He moved a loaf of bread and did not see the pistol wrapped in cloth beneath it. He waved her on, and she pedaled away slowly until she was around the corner, then rode like her life depended on it. Because it did. The final months of occupation were chaotic. German units were retreating, but they were still dangerous. Some were angry and lashed out. Others were tired and just wanted to get home. The resistance had to be careful. The closer liberation got, the more random the violence became. There were last-minute executions, last-minute betrayals, and people trying to settle old scores. Freddie and Truus kept a low profile, waiting for the day they could stop looking over their shoulders. Freedom was close, but it still required caution. By the time the Netherlands was liberated in May 1945, Freddie was still a teenager, but she had lived a lifetime. She had killed Nazis. She had watched friends die. She had carried a pistol under a loaf of bread. She had seen the worst of humanity and tried to hold on to the best of it. That kind of experience does not disappear when the war ends. It stays in your bones. If you are getting something out of this, give it a like and subscribe. I know a lot of you carry your own stories, family stories, and this kind of content only keeps going if the folks who care about it show up. It is a small action, but it helps this channel keep honoring people like Freddie. The war ended, but peace did not come easy. In the years after the liberation, the Netherlands had to rebuild and reckon with who had collaborated and who had resisted. You would think that a teenager who risked her life to fight the Nazis would be honored right away. But politics is messy. The Oversteegen family had been connected to communists, and as the Cold War began, anything smelling of communism became a problem. The sisters were not celebrated. They were sidelined. They were told, quietly, to stop talking. The silence after the war was its own kind of wound. The sisters watched former collaborators blend back into society while many resistance members kept quiet. The communist label made it worse. In the early Cold War years, that label stuck to anyone who had been involved with leftist groups, even if those groups had fought the Nazis. It was a bitter twist. The sisters had risked everything to save their country, and now they were asked to shrink into the background. It is a reminder that politics can be just as cruel in peace as it is in war. Truus coped by making art. She became a sculptor and used her work to honor the resistance. She made memorials, faces carved in stone, hands that held nothing but grief and pride. She gave interviews later, but for a long time she and Freddie kept their stories to themselves. Freddie took a different path. She married and had children. She tried to build a normal life. But normal is hard after a war like that. Freddie had nightmares. She slept poorly. She would wake up on Remembrance Day with a tight chest and a mind full of faces. She rarely spoke about how many people she had killed. When asked, she said, "You should not ask a soldier that." She kept the number to herself. That silence was not about shame. It was about carrying a burden that words cannot explain. Years later, when Freddie did talk publicly, she was plain about it. She did not call herself a hero. She said she did what she had to do. She told younger people that freedom is fragile and that if you see injustice, you cannot stay silent. She spoke softly, without drama, and that honesty carried more weight than any speech. It was the same quiet strength that had carried her through the war. You could tell she was still the girl on the bicycle, just with more years on her shoulders. In the years after the war, Freddie tried to be a normal mother. She made breakfasts, walked her children to school, and smiled at neighbors. But war memories do not clock out. A slammed door could sound like a rifle butt. A siren could take her back to a raid. She learned to live with that, to function with it, but it never fully left. That is the quiet cost that never shows up on a medal. She also lived in a country that wanted to move on. The Dutch economy rebuilt, the streets filled again, and many people preferred to forget the years of occupation. The resistance fighters who had done the dirty work were not always celebrated. Some were treated as troublemakers. That is the bitter part of war. The people who do the hardest jobs are often the last to be thanked. One thing she did keep doing was visit the grave of Hannie Schaft. She would bring red roses, a quiet tribute to a friend who never got to grow old. That tells you how deep those bonds run. These women were sisters in arms. They were kids, forced to become adults fast, and they carried each other in their memories. In 2014, nearly 7 decades after the war, the Dutch government finally honored Freddie and Truus with the Mobilization War Cross, a military decoration for service in World War II. Freddie was almost 90 years old. Truus was in her 90s, too. Imagine waiting 70 years for your country to say thank you. Freddie's son said it was the happiest day of his mother's life. That delayed recognition tells you something about history. It is not always fair in real time. Freddie died in 2018, one day before her 93rd birthday. Truus died 2 years earlier. They left behind children, grandchildren, and a story that still shakes people. People who met Freddie in her later years described her as gentle and modest. She did not carry herself like a warrior. She wore the past lightly in public, even though it sat heavy inside. When asked about those years, she would often deflect, saying the work was necessary and that many others did just as much. That humility is part of why her story hits so hard. She never demanded the spotlight. She just did the work, survived, and kept her promise to remain human. The image that sticks with me is not just the gun. It is the bicycle. A teenager riding a bicycle through occupied streets, using ordinary life as camouflage, doing extraordinary dangerous work. That is the Dutch resistance in a nutshell. Ordinary people doing the impossible. In later years, streets and schools were named after women like the Oversteegens and Hannie Schaft. Statues went up. Documentaries were made. For a long time, those honors were quiet, almost local, but they mattered. They signaled that the country was finally ready to see the full picture of the resistance, including the women who did the dirty work. It took decades, but the recognition came, and it brought their story to people who had never heard it before. Now let us pull back and look at the bigger picture for a second. During World War II, most of the Dutch population tried to survive. A small percentage collaborated, a small percentage resisted, and within that resistance, very few women took up arms, and fewer still carried out assassinations. Freddie Oversteegen was one of that tiny group. She was not a movie character. She was a real kid who carried a real gun and made real choices. That matters for another reason. A lot of old war stories, especially the ones many of us grew up with, put men at the center and leave everyone else in the background. Freddie's story breaks that pattern. The resistance needed people who could move without suspicion, and young women fit that role. They used a form of courage that did not look like a battlefield charge, but it was just as real. If you have ever wondered whether a single person can make a difference in a big war, this is your answer. She did not command an army. She rode a bicycle and made hard calls, and those hard calls saved lives. It also reminds us that history is bigger than the usual heroes, and we owe it to them to tell it straight. That is why I keep telling these stories, because respect for real courage is part of who we are. If you are wondering what kind of person does that, I think the answer goes back to her mother. Truus believed in action. She taught her girls to help others even when it cost them. She told them to stay human. Freddie and Truus held that line. They did not break. They did not become monsters. They killed to stop monsters. There is a difference, and it matters. People sometimes ask if these stories are exaggerated. The truth is, no one knows the exact number of Nazis and collaborators the sisters killed. That was not the point. The point was that they were willing to do what had to be done to protect their neighbors and their country. The point was that a teenage girl, who looked like she could not hurt a fly, could lure a Nazi officer into the woods and never come back. That is the power of resolve in a desperate time. And that brings us back to the beginning. The innocent-looking Dutch teenager who lured Nazis to their deaths was not a myth. She was Freddie Oversteegen. She was 14, then 15, then 16, doing work that most grown men would not dare. She used her youth as a cover, her smile as a mask, and her bicycle as a getaway car. This happens, but then this. She lures a Nazi, but then she lives with the memory. She saves a family, but then she carries the cost. These stories matter because they remind us that war is not just tanks and generals. It is also teenagers, mothers, and neighbors making terrible choices under pressure. It is a girl in a simple coat walking toward a German officer, knowing she might not come back. It is the quiet courage that does not show up in the big headlines, but changes the outcome on the ground. Listening to this story, you might think it belongs to another world, but the lesson is not locked in 1940. The lesson is about the kind of person you decide to be when pressure hits. Freddie was not born a warrior. She was a kid from a poor family who learned to act when it mattered. That is a lesson any generation can use. You do not have to carry a pistol to carry courage. Sometimes courage looks like speaking up, helping a neighbor, or refusing to go along with something you know is wrong. That is the legacy she left behind. If you are a man who grew up hearing World War II stories from your father or your uncle, you know the tone. It was not about glory. It was about doing the job and coming home. Freddie did her job and she came home, but the war came with her. That is why her story matters. It is a reminder that the price of freedom is paid in quiet places by people you would never guess are fighters. So if you are still here with me, I appreciate you. Subscribe if you liked the video. And if you want to help keep these stories alive, give it a like and share it with someone who cares about the real history, not just the Hollywood version. That little action keeps the memory of Freddie Oversteegen and women like her from fading into the background.